Maybe the Syrians in our communities have not been exposed enough, and people don't get to know their stories enough. You know, I do know that there are wonderful things happening all over America with resettled Syrian refugees and the communities coming out to help them, which are resettlement communities are generally religious, very often Christian, and they are actually appalled that no more Syrians are going to be able to come. So, yeah, I mean, I think that a lot, but I hope that there will be a lot of outrage at the banning of a whole nation of people really in need.
Tonight, I'm extremely pleased to have Melissa Fleming with us to discuss her book, A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea, One Refugee's Incredible Story of Love, Loss, and Survival. Melissa is Head of Communications and Chief Spokesperson for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and is one of the world's experts on refugees. She is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and NPR.
My job is to represent and give voice to the forcibly displaced people of our world. And we had to, I've been working in this job for 8 years, and when I came 8 years ago, there were 40 million forcibly displaced people in the world. And last June, we announced that there are over 60 million. So we have the worst crisis of displacement since any time since World War II. And yet what we're seeing in the world today is growing hostility, closing of borders, closing of airports, and you know, really rejection of the people, the very people I think who need us most, and those are the victims of war, the wars that our leaders have been unable to prevent and unable to stop. And my job is to make a case for why we should help the victims. And there is this saying that goes, statistics are human beings with the tears dried off. And this is why in my communications I always try to tell a human story. And the story of Doaa is one that when I heard it, I traveled to meet her immediately to find out more, because for me this was a story that just, didn't leave me at night, and it's really gripped my heart, and it's really inspired me, and she's become a very close friend. I hate to think that right now I couldn't even invite her to come and visit me and my family here in this country. And I hope this is temporary and that this ends. But let me tell you a little bit about the story of Doaa and a little bit about the book. And I'm going to read a few little passages. But Doaa comes from the town of Daraa in Syria, which is where the war in Syria sparked. And it was 2011 when she was 16 years old, living in a relatively poor family, but doing fine. And all around, they were turning on the televisions and they saw the Arab Spring was happening, and the people were erupting in protest and demanding changes of their governments. And soon she saw that in her streets, people that she knew started to go out and demand changes of their oppressive government. They were peaceful protesters, and she became very inspired and she joined them. But very soon she was also witness to not her government saying, okay, we will give in to the demands, but her government turning their guns on the people who were just asking for more freedom and being shot in the streets. And this escalated very quickly into a terrible conflict, the one that we know today has been going on and raging for 6 years. But this was her neighborhood where she saw the spark. She was out there every day. She was there when soldiers, came into her home and demanded to search everyone. Her father started hearing rumors that young women were being kidnapped and raped. He was starting to get very worried. His barber shop, that was a thriving little shop in the center of the city, he would go there every day despite the dangers, but one day he arrived and it had been bombed, and it was pretty much ruined. So faced with a conflict that was spiraling out of control, faced with not just guns on protesters, but bombs that were falling on houses, the family, the parents made this decision, as so many other refugee families did, to take the family and cross the borders and get out of the country. This was a terrible, terrible news for Doaa, who was very attached and felt like she should be out there protesting, and plus she was just very attached, as every refugee is, as we all are, to our homes, to our communities, to our schools, to our livelihoods, and that decision to give all that up is really tough. So they ended up going to Egypt, a place that was initially very welcoming, because the government there, it was Mohammed Morsi, Muslim Brotherhood, very welcoming towards Syrian refugees at first, and they were, you know, even government officials were coming and bringing them packages of food and blankets, and it was a struggle, but it was okay. Until then, there was a coup d'etat in Egypt, and the new government started associating Syrian refugees with the old government, and things got, you know, when they would go for walks along the sea, the people who once nodded in greeting to them averted their stares and turned their heads away, and the girl started feeling harassed and threatened. Her little brother was told with his other Syrian classmates at school that he should sit on the floor and shouldn't have a desk anymore. So things were starting to get very hostile. And Doaa was working a factory job. Things were really tough, and all she did every day was focus on Syria, calling her friends, finding out what was happening. And then this young man arrived, another Syrian refugee named Bassem. He had been a fighter for the opposition, and terrible things happened to him. He had been imprisoned, he'd been tortured, and he escaped too. And he arrived in this community, a friend of her cousin's, and as soon as he saw Doaa, it was love at first sight. But she didn't want to have anything to do with him. And you'll read in it takes 2 chapters to get through this love story, which is really, it's almost Shakespearean, really. But she's rejecting him, and he's going around, you know, to her sisters and buying them gifts, and befriends the mother, and then finally, in a very melodramatic way, you know, threatens to go back to Syria and go back to fight. And then she realized, actually, well, you know, actually maybe I do like this guy, and she completely, it was all just being completely stubborn. And then they fall in love, and they have this wonderful engagement. And then Bassem starts saying, and this is 2014, and the first kind of Syrian refugees were starting to arrive in Europe. And, you know, at that time, the numbers of the refugees in the neighboring countries were just growing and growing as the Syria war just spread throughout the country and drove more and more people from their homes. Today, there are 5 million. Then there were probably about 2.5 to 3 million refugees. And many of them were just living in terrible conditions in the neighboring countries. My organization, UNHCR, was doing its best to help them, but being chronically underfunded, there's just the minimum that we could provide. So Bassem is convincing her night after night, and she's saying, no way. Don't forget, I almost drowned when I was 6. You know, I don't know how to swim, I don't go near the water, and haven't you heard those stories of people drowning? And he would say, yes, but look, and he'd show his Facebook page, and he'd show the friends that had made it. Look at him in Amsterdam, and he's studying at the University of Amsterdam, and this is our friend in Munich, and he's doing really well, and he's got a job. Finally, he convinced, I think what convinced her was, he said, and if we go and we make it, we'll go to this country called Sweden. In Sweden, they're really nice to Syrian refugees. And there you can apply for family reunification. If you make it there, then we can bring your mother and your father and your sisters can go to school there, and Hamidi, your little brother, he'll be in a really nice place. And that really convinced her. So they got together, their life savings, she sold her jewelry, they sold a computer, $2,500 each, which was a huge sum of money for them. And they went to one of these smugglers, and these smugglers are, you know, they're criminals. But so they showed them this photograph of this wonderful cruise ship. You know, they said, we're gonna take you to Europe. It's going to be safe, and don't worry. Long story short, 2 attempts, 2 arrests. Doaa getting more and more determined, also getting more and more ill. She became very anemic and not well. But anyway, they finally, in the dark of the night, they're taken onto this beach, onto dinghies, and onto this boat. And they never really expected a cruise liner, but they certainly didn't expect the rusty, dilapidated fishing boat that they were forced onto. And this boat was packed with 500 refugees, and 100 of them were children. Most of them were from Syria, many of them were from Gaza. There had been an offensive in August 2014 on Gaza, and many of them had left. So they're on this boat, and they're up on the top deck, and they're shoulder to shoulder and feet to feet, and it stinks, and the toilets are overflowing, and there's only stale bread, and the smugglers, their captains, are not very nice people, and it's scary. But there's this solidarity among the people. Weird things, they had to change boats a couple of times. But on the 4th day in the water, they asked the captain, how much longer until we reach Italy? And the captain said, only 19 more hours and you will reach Italy. And they all kind of relaxed, and many of them broke out in song, and the children started smiling and playing, and the sun was coming up. When Doaa all of a sudden heard this noise in the distance and looked and saw this boat approaching at high speed, and 10 men on the boat, and the men had sticks in their hand, and they started hurling the sticks at the boat and yelling insults, "You dogs!" And they were just completely shocked, and they were holding on to the side, and all of a sudden they felt this bang, and it felt almost like a missile. And the boat is shaken, and it starts tipping over, and then the other boat speeds away and then comes back and rams a hole in the side of Doaa and Bassem's boat. And Doaa knew right then that the people below deck were doomed. It started sinking really fast. And she started saying, "Oh no, please, everything but this, but not the water," and loses her grip of Bassem, and Bassem falls in, and she's holding on, and it really awful ordeal as she's seeing people falling in, and she's clutching and watching as children are getting caught up in the propeller. And then she falls into the water at Bassem's urging, let go and just fall in, and she comes under these plastic tarps, and a drowning person tries to pull her down. But she manages to pull herself up and wave her arms and legs and keep herself afloat. And Bassem then comes up to her with this child's floating ring, which is the kind that we use for toddlers in swimming pools, young children. And luckily, she's a very slight 19-year-old woman who she did, instead of putting it over her like this because she didn't want her legs in the water, she puts her arms and her legs and dangles them over the side. And Bassem treads water next to her. And then there are only about 100 survivors initially, and they just all prayed for rescue, and nobody came. And as one night went by, Doaa and Bassem even saw how men in the distance would take their life vests off in such despair because they'd lost members of their family and just let the sea take them. And Bassem himself was getting weak. And I'm just going to read you a passage now from this scene. Doaa choked on the stench from the dead. When Bassem awoke and observed the scene around him, he began apologizing again. But this time Doaa could hear resignation in his voice, as if he had to give up hope that they would survive. It sounded to Doaa as if his apologies were actually Bassem saying goodbye. "Don't worry," Doaa assured Bassem, feeling her love for him well up in her chest. She too had come to accept that they might not make it much longer. This is our fate. A man nearby must have noticed Doaa and Bassem's spirit flagging, and he yelled over to Bassem, "Keep moving or your body will go stiff." And then he went and swam for a minute. And then a small group of survivors gathered around the couple treading water, some probably delirious. One said, "There's a cafe nearby. Go get us some tea." Amid the cacophony, Bassem looked directly at Doaa, raised his voice loud enough so everyone could hear, and solemnly declared, "I love you more than anyone I've ever known. I'm sorry I let you down. I only wanted the best for you." And Doaa saw that his eyes were feverish, and he stared into her eyes as if it was the last time he would ever see them. He spoke with an urgency she hadn't heard since he'd threatened to go back to Syria if she wouldn't agree to marry him. It was as if getting the words out was the most important thing he'd ever done. "It was my job to take care of you," he said, "and I failed. I wanted us to have a new life together. I wanted the best for you. Forgive me before I die, my love." "There's nothing to forgive," Doaa told him through sobs. "We will be together always, in life and in death." And she pleaded with him to hold on, telling him over and over that he was not to blame. And as she reached out to stroke his cheek, she noticed an older man swimming toward them, clutching a small baby on his shoulder. He held onto a water canister with his other hand, kicking his legs hard to get close to them. When he reached them, he looked at Doaa with pleading eyes and said, "I'm exhausted. Could you please hold on to Malik for a while?" The baby was wearing pink pajamas, had 2 small teeth, and was crying. Doaa thought the baby looked just like what the name Malik meant, angel. The man explained that he was her grandfather. He was a fisherman from Gaza, and they had left to escape the latest Israeli bombardment. 27 members of their family had been on the boat, and all the others had drowned. "We are the only 2 who survived. Please keep this girl with you," he begged. "She's only 9 months old. Look after her. Consider her part of you. My life is over." Doaa reached for Malik and settled her on her chest, resting the baby's cheek on the Quran that still lay next to Doaa's heart. At her touch, Malik relaxed and stopped crying, and Doaa immediately took comfort in having the child's body next to her. Malik's grandfather touched the girl's face. "My little angel, what did you do to deserve this, poor thing? Goodbye, little one. Forgive me, I'm going to die." And then he swam off, and Doaa and Bassem focused their attention on the small child. The young life seemed to rally Bassem for a while she stroked Malik's soft, cold cheeks. Moments later, Malik's grandfather returned, checking on her, and seeing that she was in good care, said goodbye again. The next time they looked in his direction, they saw him floating face down in the sea, just 10 meters away. It wasn't long after that Bassem lost his strength too, and Doaa had to watch as the love of her life slipped from her fingers and drowned before her eyes. And she would have followed him too, but she now knew that she had a little 9-month-old baby to keep alive. Just hours later, a family who she'd met on the boat, a family of 4, appeared close to her. She had played with the 18-month-old child, Masa, on the boat and recognized her, and the mother recognized Doaa, and the same thing happened again. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but in the end, Doaa ended up with 2 babies, 18-month-old Masa, and had to watch as her parents and her older sister, 6-year-old sister, drowned in front of her. And she was like this for 4 days and 4 nights in the water. And there was no food, there was no water to feed them. And she, as they got agitated, rubbed their veins to keep them warm and sang them nursery rhymes that she remembered, said words to them from the Quran, and prayed for rescue. And on the 4th day in the water in the morning, she looked up into the sky and she saw what she thought was a mirage, but it was an airplane flying overhead. And she waved her arms, and the other survivors, and they were only 11 at that point, waved their empty water bottles, and then the plane went away. And several hours later, when she was about to give up all hope, it was starting to turn dark, and the wind was picking up, and it was really a kind of frightening scene. And she saw this huge orange boat in the distance. It was a chemical tanker. And she felt like the tiniest little speck in the ocean compared. And she waved her arms and started yelling, Arab, Arab, which means, oh God, oh God. And the others were doing the same. And on the tanker, meanwhile, and I've interviewed the captain and a couple of the crewmen, they had received this radio call from Malta that said, go to the scene, there's been a shipwreck, and they rushed to the coordinates that were given. And then they got a radio call from another ship that had arrived earlier and said, we picked up the last survivors. There were only 5. The rest is all corpses. Give up. Don't go there. They're all dead. But the captain of this ship said, I am not going to be satisfied until I go see for myself. And he ordered his men to turn on all the searchlights and to look for any survivor they could, put the lifeboat in the water, and started going around the sea. And it was becoming more and more windy, but they heard all of a sudden this voice, this faint woman's voice in the distance, and they kept trying to steer the lifeboat to the voice, and the voice kept being pushed by the wind. So Doaa is hearing them call and hearing these English words, and she's calling even louder, and they're calling to her, and it took 2 hours for them to connect. But finally they did, and she pulled on a stick that he reached out to her, and they were completely astonished. She had this light jacket covering the babies when she opened up her jacket, and they pulled these 2 babies into the lifeboat. She says at that point that she tried to push away and go drown with Bassem, but they said she was so weak that they just lifted her into the boat. And they took them all up into the merchant vessel, and they brought them into this little medic room. But these are merchant seamen. They have, they're radioing doctors on Malta. They called for a helicopter that was coming from Greece. And when Doaa was pulled up into the helicopter hours later, she looked around for baby Malik, and they told her, unfortunately, the little girl drew her last breath on the boat. But little Massa pulled through. And they were taken to the island of Crete, and on this pediatric hospital on Crete, the doctor said that Massa was at the edge of death. But is anyone Greek here? Kind of. Stephanie. They are, not only do they have, it's a very good hospital, I visited them, they have all the modern medical facility, but they are also just the sweetest people, and they were showering this baby with the biggest hugging and kissing and singing, and so this baby is like miraculously pulled through, and all of Greece wanted to adopt Massa, and then Doaa is in another hospital in somewhere on the other part of the island, and she's pulling through it. An Egyptian family takes her in, and then a number was published on Facebook, and all of a sudden all these messages started coming in. Doaa, I know you survived. Do you know what happened to my father, my sister, my aunt, my daughter? And one of those messages that came in said, Doaa, I think that you saved my niece, Massa, and there was a photograph of little Massa, and it was her uncle, who is a refugee in Sweden. And so, long story short, they survived. They're all in Sweden now. You'll see, if you do read the book, the rest of the story. I probably gave way too much away, but there's so much more detail in there that I really would love you to read. But I would love to end this, because I think it's important for our time, with a note from Doaa that she wrote at the end of the book. She said, in this book I have shared my suffering with you. It's only a small glimpse of the hardship and pain that refugees around the world endure. I represent just one voice among the millions who risk their lives every day in order to live a life of dignity. The perilous journey refugees take in order to reach safety in Europe or here often leads to despair and death. We put our lives in the hands of cruel and merciless smugglers because we have no other choice. We've been confronted with the horrors of war and the indignity of losing our homes. Our only wish is to live in peace. We are not terrorists. We are human beings, just like you. We have hearts that feel, yearn, love, and hurt. Every family in my country has lost so much that they've had to rebuild their homes in their hearts. We've lost our homeland, and our dreams are all in the past. If only the tragedies we've lived through were just a nightmare that we could wake up from. The people responsible for the war in Syria don't care about the shedding of the blood of a child, tearing apart families, or destroying homes. And the world doesn't seem to mourn for all the people who have drowned in the sea during their search for sanctuary. My fiancé, who was the love of my life, slipped out of my arms and drowned right in front of my eyes, and there was nothing I could do about it. Now my life without him feels like a painting without any color. More than anything, I just wish he were still here with me. When I was afloat in the sea, I did my best to keep Masa and Malik alive. Over those 4 horrific days, they became a part of me. When I learned that precious Malik took her last breath after we were rescued, I felt like someone tore my heart out of my chest. But I do find comfort in knowing that she has made her way to heaven, a heaven where she has at last found safety and there is no fighting or wars. I am grateful to all of those who refuse to remain indifferent. And I especially want to recognize our Egyptian friends who made my family feel welcome, the captain and the crew of the CPO Japan who came to my rescue, the pilots who pulled us into their helicopter, the doctors on Crete who saved our lives, and my host family on Crete who took me in and gave me the space to heal. And I also want to give special thanks to UNHCR for arranging our resettlement and to the government of Sweden for giving us a safe and promising new home. One day, I hope to return to Syria so I can breathe again, even if it's just for one day. That would be enough. Thank you very much.
Can you tell us how you and she connected?
So I read about her story. It was in the Greek press, and then UNHCR's office in Greece put the story on, did a little story for our UNHCR Greece website, and I read it. And I just, I arranged a visit to go see her, and I interviewed her and talked to her, and we just somehow really connected, and she entrusted her story to me. She's in fact never told anyone this story. I mean, not even her parents. So it's really, now that it's been published, it's been out there for 2 days. This is going to be the first time that people in the world read all the details of the ordeal that happened to her. So I first told her story as a TED Talk on the TED stage, and then it became a book, and this was then, it was 70 hours at least of interviews and back and also with her family, with other survivors, with others. But she's now and her family have now become really close friends, so yeah.
And I don't say this jokingly, are you going to send a copy to the White House?
I will if you want.
Okay. Susan, you send it. Okay. Yeah. I'm hoping the right people read it, because I think there's just this, you know, to call people who are fleeing terrorism and fleeing atrocities, war atrocities, and lump them all together and say they're all terrorists. These are the victims. It's just irresponsible. We need to have a real understanding for who these people are. And I think the more people, find out about the war in Syria and what is driving people and what life is like as a refugee, what drives people to then continue to risk their lives again and take to the seas. There's not enough investment in the refugees who are in these, most of the refugees in the world are not in Europe, or they're not in the United States, by far. The vast majority are in the neighboring countries of the war countries, so are in and around Syria, in and around Somalia, countries like Kenya, countries like Pakistan and Iran, who have all the Afghan refugees. So it's a real small minority that are actually coming to the richer part of the world. So we're asking, please invest in people like Doaa who are in Egypt and in these other countries and in those communities, so that maybe they don't feel compelled, but also do your share. And I think one of the big issues that everybody's learning about this week is refugee resettlement, which is the program that UNHCR runs that takes refugees who are vulnerable and allows them to take airplanes after a huge amount of screening. And for this country, the screening process can take up to 2 years. There is not a person who arrives in the United States who is more vetted, screened than a refugee. You can't get more thorough than this, and more than any other country in the world. And then they're allowed to resettle here, and it's a very successful program that enables it's responsibility sharing. So we urge this to continue, and we hope that it will also continue here. Yeah.
When you say vulnerable families, what specifies one family more vulnerable than another?
Okay, so for example, Doaa was considered vulnerable because of the tragedy she went through, and she was a woman alone living in a country where, I mean, it was Greece, but because of the trauma, UNHCR was able to put her in that category. Her family in Egypt had been, because the smugglers heard about Doaa, saw that Doaa had spoken to the media and pretty much, described mass murder on the Mediterranean Sea. The smugglers showed up at Doaa's mother's door, knocked on the door, pretended he was an official, demanded passports, and then texted them right afterwards saying, "Oh, I know the names of your daughters." And so they were being threatened. And so that's a category too, where UNHCR could say they are no longer safe in this community, and so we can resettle them. Victims of torture, there are, for example, LGBT refugees who are living in, fleeing countries like Iraq or Syria, and then going to countries that are not tolerant of LGBT people. That's a category. So these are people who cannot, people with medical conditions who cannot cope in those refugee hosting communities.
If you don't mind, tell us a little bit more. You started a new position,
yeah,
and sort of, in this environment, which hopefully will loosen up a little bit, how your organization is faring.
Yeah. So I still work for. Well, I work for the United Nations, right? So I work for this organization, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It's based in Geneva, but it has 140 offices around the world, 900 staff. 9,000 staff, and it runs pretty much in countries that need help the most. It runs big refugee operations, so refugee camps. It assists refugees who are living in urban environments and in other parts of the world, we advocate for the rights of refugees and the legal rights of refugees. So it's an organization that's on the front lines. We also have 450 staff working inside Syria who are trying to help, probably the people in the worst situation are the people who are stuck inside Syria, and there are over 7 million internally displaced people inside Syria who we're trying to reach and trying to help. Many of them are in places that are besieged and whatever. So it's an organization that is basically, its goal is to help the displaced and to stand up for the 1951 Refugee Convention, which allows anyone who is fleeing war or persecution to seek asylum in another country, making sure the countries that signed up for that are living up to that or trying. So my latest job is I'm temporarily, I've been on the transition team for the new Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, and I'm working on his strategic communications. So.
And how did you get into this work? What attracted you?
Well, I've always worked for international organizations. I was always interested in foreign affairs, but so I've been abroad for many years working for a different, and in fact the one before that was completely different. It was the International Atomic Energy Agency. But there I was dealing with potential human catastrophe. And then I moved to the refugee cause, which is real life human catastrophe. So, yeah. So, yes.
You talked about their ship getting rammed by another boat. I had never heard of that happening before. Is that common?
I think it's such a mystery, and I don't think we'll ever know. I mean, I think the only theory could be that they just didn't, they were part of the same gang and didn't want the responsibility of taking the boat all the way there, and just decided, we got our $1 million, which is that's pretty much what they earned from those 500 people. The children, the young children were free or half price, but yeah, Bill, and I don't know, but we'll never know, because there was never an international investigation. There was never any justice. I don't think it's, I mean, what you do hear a lot is that the smugglers, I mean, pile so many people on boats that if they're not and they know it, that if they're not rescued within hours, they're going to sink. They're going to, if one person moves. So one way or the other, it's putting people to their deaths, and it's really just a horrible business.
I'm Syrian myself, and I want to thank you for, I had heard your TED Talk before, and thank you for doing this, but somebody who's head of communications, and what do you recommend what can we do to, for 6 years we've been trying to pose our, suffering and plight to the world, and not much has been done. What more can we do to make our story be heard?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Just talk here. Everybody go get to know you afterwards. I think, I don't know, maybe the Syrians in our communities have not been exposed enough, and people don't get to know their stories enough. I do know that there are wonderful things happening all over America with resettled Syrian refugees, and the communities coming out to help them, which are, resettlement communities are generally religious, very often Christian, and they are actually appalled that no more Syrians are going to be able to come. So, yeah, I think that a lot, but I hope that there will be a lot of outrage at the banning of a whole nation of people really in need. But yeah, individual stories are the only way. And so if you're a Syrian, and I get to know people and just talk. Yeah.
Melissa, I was going to say that, we are told all the time to talk to our congresspeople, write them letters, call them on the phone, get a hold of those guys, because they're the ones who can make the difference. And I really believe that. So I'm sending your book not only to my congressman, but to the president. And I want you to write special note. But I really think that's part of what we have to do.
Yeah. I think it has been seen, especially here in America, as a real far off conflict. And if you look at neighboring Canada, it's been actually amazing. The welcome and the response, and they have this program called sponsorship, and where an individual or a community can sign up to sponsor refugees, and they just need to come up with a certain amount of money and commit to 1 year. And the government cannot meet the demand from the citizens of Canada who want to sponsor refugees. So I really think that it's the political leadership that leads the people. We have so much evidence, including polling, that there is a lot of compassion in communities and societies when people know that people are coming to their country seeking asylum because they're fleeing war, they are very open and want to help. So we saw this also in Europe. It's the politicians who exploit the fears of people that then distort, and there has been such a distortion of the narrative. I mean, it really started in Europe. It started in Hungary, actually, where the Hungarian president was saying, all these people coming, they're all economic migrants. And anyway, you know, if there are some refugees among them, they're all men, and they're cowards because they should be back fighting. And anyway, they're probably, a lot of them are terrorists. And everybody was like, this guy, this is, you know, how could he be saying these things? This is just outrageous, because we have the statistics, and they were mostly women and children. They were coming from Syria and Iraq. They were definitely not coming to take jobs. They were coming for sanctuary. And so it was, but then his narrative started catching fire, and it started the populist politicians all around Europe, all the way to the UK, and then to the United States, started embracing this narrative. And frankly, it's not, there was very little truth in it, but as we're seeing, that seems to win votes. Yeah. So, okay. Well, I want to thank you all so much for coming and for your interest.
What I didn't understand was that the new economics of college are leaving people with extremely little money, really short. And that in some cases, they are left so short, they don't even have enough food to eat, even while they try to go to class.